Well, welcome back to another session of our study of the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. If I'm not mistaken, this is episode 10. We're going to be looking at chapter 8 in our manual that we are making available. If you've not yet asked for one, it's a free PDF file that we will send you free of charge. If you would let us ask for one. This is part 2, so you need to let me know which part you want. I've gotten some people just now starting with chapter 1, or the first sessions, finding us, and so it's getting a little confusing when people call and email. So email us at Ezra, E-Z-R-A, at St. Elijah Orthodox Church.com, and let us know that you would like the PDF file for either part 1 or we're now on part 2. And if you're watching this maybe a year from now, if it's still on, and I hope it will be still on the internet and available to you through the efforts of Richard Yeager, our videographer here, and Charlie Ward, who keep us online. So grateful for them and their work in behalf of this ministry. We hope by then that it may be available in an edited and published book form and available directly from Amazon.com under the author name of Ezra Ham, H-A-M. But in the meantime, we do have the PDF file that you may find extremely useful with all the footnotes and citations that are there, as well as the illustrations. This is part 2 that we're making our way through right now. So this is what we're talking that you'd be able to get in a PDF form. We've been having so many of you that have written, sent the email for part 2, and it's possible that some of you have asked for part 1, and I couldn't keep track of all of it, and I've not said hello to you, and because many of you have already been with us in part 1 and so forth. But I did receive 2 recently that I thought would be, if you don't mind my sharing them with you. We're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are discussing the apocalypse and the historical context of it. You see, we live our faith inside a historical context. And the historical context of 2020 is the COVID-19 pandemic that's impacting, I'm certain, every one of us around the globe. It's a global issue, health issue that we're facing. And so sometimes because of social distancing and wearing our mask and the restrictions being placed upon us, there's a sense of sadness, there's a sense of depression, there's a sense of isolation that begins to unavoidably, it seems, creep into our lives and our personalities. I'm so grateful that you're finding us on the internet. I realize we're not Zooming, so I don't get to see you. I do a Zoom class here locally for a local Bible study, and I appreciate getting to see people so much. And I guess that's why getting your emails, it's just the interaction, to know that we're in this together and we're not isolated and not alone. So I'm so grateful for you participating and finding us. But let me just mention one we got from Alan. Alan, I have been following the seminars on YouTube. I've been thoroughly enjoying them. I understand there's material that goes with the lessons. Could you possibly send that to me? And yes, we've already replied and sent this to Alan. I am from South Africa, living in the port city of Durban. I have just recently discovered the Orthodox Church and am just blown away. I was, and he names a Protestant denomination that he was a member of, and it took some time for me to realize I was on the wrong end of the faith. There is an Orthodox church in my city, and once COVID-19 is under control, their classes will begin. And then he tells us and encourages us to keep up the work that we're doing. Alan, we are thankful you sent to us, but most of all, we're thankful that you have found, we're just a little bitty candle, just a little bitty flickering light way out here in the middle of the United States in Oklahoma City. And thank God that you found that little flickering light, and it's been a blessing to you, and we encourage you as you continue to grow in walking in the light that God is now giving you in your life. That's Alan in South Africa. And then we received this one as well. I am Sonia from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I was born in Romania and baptized Orthodox as a baby during the communist regime. I found the seminar about the apocalypse while I was watching Finding the Church Jesus Built, another of our seminars. I would like a PDF of the seminar. I found your seminars on YouTube while I was looking for a way to explain the Orthodox Church and faith to my friend who is, and then she names a Protestant denomination. I ended up learning about my own Orthodox Church as I never thought before. I also found out how many misconceptions this particular Protestant denomination has about us. I felt my friend's pain when he told me that he is not sure about his own salvation. Thank you for bringing these seminars to us. So God bless each of you that are watching us. I want all of us to know we're in this together, and none of this happens without all of us. I'm grateful that St. Elijah Church is here and that they provide us the opportunity, that Richard comes and provides the equipment and the technology and his time, as well as Charlie Ward to post this online, that all of us together, though we don't see one another, are working together for the kingdom, and by God's grace, we'll get through to the other side of this pandemic. Well, let us begin today's session then. We're looking at chapter 8 in our notes. It's episode number 10, the letter to the 7 churches. And today we want to look at Thyatira and Sardis. Now, Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum that we've already looked at are the 3 major cities of the Roman province of Asia, the western half of Turkey. Each of them were vying for imperial recognition. They wanted the emperor's attention. The remaining 4 cities of the 7 cities of the apocalypse are representative of the majority of the cities of Turkey. So we come to the letter to the church of Thyatira. And to the angel of the church of Thyatira write, "These things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire, and his feet like fine brass. I know your works, love, service, faith, and your patience. And as for your works, the last are greater than the first. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman, Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants, to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, and she did not repent. Indeed, I will cast her into a sick bed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he who searches the minds and hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your works. Now to you I say, and to the rest in Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put on you no other burden, but hold fast what you have till I come. And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give the power over the nations, over the ethnicities. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessels, as I have also received from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Thyatira was a smaller city, less wealthy, and of less imperial importance than the three we've already examined. It had an imperial altar with an imperial priesthood. The altar was in a royal room, a basilikos and ekos, but it did not have its own imperial temple. It was a room inside some other structure. Now, this is not to suggest that Thyatira was impoverished or totally insignificant. Thyatira was a commercial city in which various trade guilds, syndicates in the Greek, such as wool makers, linen makers, outer garment clothing district, cloth dyers, leather workers, tanners, potters, bakers, slave dealers, bronzesmiths created and supplied products throughout the region. St. Paul's first convert in Europe was Lydia, a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, we're told in the book of Acts. Well, regarding Jezebel and the Nicolaitans, in addition to, we've used the term Orthodox Roman religions because Domitian demanded that the worship of the Roman religions be done correctly in an Orthodox fashion, not with novelty. And so with this Orthodox paganism that Domitian sought to enforce, in that era, there were hybrid versions of ancient Mesopotamian fertility cults, Greek mystery religions, and even Persian religions that had many adherents in the eastern end of the Roman Empire in the first century when the Apocalypse is written. The Nicolaitans, which are mentioned in Revelation chapter 2, verse 6, and in 15, and Jezebel, mentioned in Revelation 2:20, both offer an heretical hybrid version of the gospel that mixes the sexuality of the mystery religions with Christianity. You have that hybridization of culture that takes place in many, many, many religions, so that in order to keep a particular religion popular, it offers whatever is the current fad inside of a culture. Even in the worship of the kings and the emperors, even as it was historically embedded in the cultural history of Mesopotamia, the Middle East, and Egypt, as we've already examined in the last several weeks. Also then, sexuality of the fertility cults was also deeply and historically embedded in the religions of the area. Even the ancient Israelites had a long history of having to withstand becoming hybrid, had to withstand the intermingling of the Israelite religion with its fertility cults provided by her neighbors once she moved into the Promised Land. An academic study of the fertility cults and the mystery religions is well outside our present scope. However, the issue of the hybridization of religion and culture are very much part of our world today. You could argue that they've always been part of our world, the last 2,000 years, but in particular, we would be attentive to the issue of hybridization, making a hybrid out of modifying Christianity in terms of the flavor of the month or the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, the spirit of the age in which we're in. This letter to Thyatira addresses this issue. You see, it is the hybridization of the gospel, and we're looking at it here sexually, but as we shall also discover, hybridization, making a hybrid, mixing the gospel with sexuality. It's also possible to make a hybrid out of mixing the gospel with politics and a political position. Are all versions of Christianity equal? Instead of speaking of Christianity and the gospel in the singular, if all versions are equal, then should we not speak of Christianities in the plural? There are a growing chorus of voices now speaking of ancient Christianities, which opens the door for them to then speak of Christianities in the present. St. Paul, of course, dealt with this issue in his letter to the Galatians, in which he spoke in terms of the gospel versus different heterodox gospels. In addition to many speaking today of Christianities in the plural, there is the 21st century reality of changing cultural understandings of human sexuality and the current hybridization of Christianity, of churches embracing both new sexuality as well as politics. Again, these issues are outside our present scope. However, a changing culture means a changing laity, a changing us sitting in the pews. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear in what we're about to discuss. I am not here debating against the culture in which I find myself in 2020. But I am here today to make a distinction of us becoming aware of the culture that we're in. There's a difference. Some of us, you see, still think the world out there is the world in our heads. Let me assure you, it is not. The world in my head, my Leave It to Beaver 1950 Cold World War that I grew up in with Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best, that world is long gone. That world is not the world my own children grew up in, and it is certainly not the world my grandchildren are now growing up in. We must not put our heads in the sand. We must be aware of culture, and we must be aware of whether or not we are making a hybrid, either politically or socially, out of the gospel, and we seek then to preach a gospel that's acceptable to culture, or we seek to make somehow Christianity acceptable, so maybe the world will want it after all. So for whatever the reason, I am not criticizing culture. I am making a distinction between the gospel and culture, and we will follow this gospel through the apocalypse to see then, when we finally get to part 3, the mystagogic meaning that is being shared with the church and proclaimed to the church in the apocalypse of John. We're not there yet, so we're still in this movement of discovering what is actually in the apocalypse, so that then we can begin to be open to discovering what John is saying, or what Christ through John, this revelation of Jesus Christ that is being revealed to us. So, the issues of the 21st century are not limited to institutional issues, that is, issues facing the church as the church. The issues of the 21st century, first and foremost, are issues facing those of us sitting in the pews. This we have in common with first century Christianity in the 7 churches of Asia. You see, these letters were being written to parishioners of churches in Asia, to parishioners, as well as to the clergy of the parish. The changing issues of human sexuality and the adaptation of laity and clergy alike is as much an issue in our lives today as was Jezebel and the Nicolaitans in lives of Christians in the first century. Again, I'm not calling anybody a Jezebel. I'm not trying to label anybody with any label. I'm simply wanting to talk about culture and the gospel as 2 separate realities. It is because the 21st century has so much in common with the first century that it is important for us to turn aside and consider, even briefly, the cultural sexuality faced by Christians at the time of the apocalypse. Well, here we are 21 centuries later. Let's talk about us for just a second. God's long funeral is over, and we are back where we started. 2,000 years of history have melted into the backstory, which nobody reads anymore. We have returned to year 0, AD 0, or rather 0 CE, because we are in the common era now, the years of our Lord having expired. I'm quoting from a book by Ferdinand Mount, written in 2010. He continues, "So much about society that is now emerging bears an astonishing resemblance to the most prominent features of what we call the classical world, its institutions, its priorities, its recreations, its physics, its sexual morality, its food, its politics, even its religion. Often without our being in the least aware of it, the ways in which we live our rich and varied lives corresponds almost eerily, Mount says, to the ways in which the Greeks and Romans lived theirs. Whether we are eating and drinking, bathing or exercising, or making love, pondering, admiring, or inquiring, our habits of thought and action, our diversions and concentrations recall theirs. It is as though the 1,500 years after the fall of Rome had been a timeout from the traditional ways of being human. 1,500 years from the Western perspective that Rome fell in the West in 500 by the end of the 500s. Ferdinand Mount wrote full circle at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Today we are 3 months from the end of the second, when I wrote this, we are 3 months from the end of the second and beginning of the third decade. Well, about a month and a half closer now. Mount did not prophesy about what was coming. He simply stated what is or was then a reality in 2010. Ferdinand Mount wrote Full Gospel at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Today we are 3 months. We were 3 months away when I wrote this several weeks ago. Today we are 3 months from the end of the second and beginning of the third decade of the 21st century. Mount did not prophesy about what was coming. He simply stated what is. And that's all I'm doing today, is stating what is or was then reality in 2010. Mount devotes an entire chapter to the changes of culture, understanding of sexuality, a chapter, by the way, that now a decade later seems rather tame to where our culture is today. For those who doubt that culturally the years of our Lord have expired, just consider the examples of current college classes on human sexuality that are pictured below. The world in our heads is not the world of our children and not the world our grandchildren will grow up in, as these two different brochures, or one brochure front and back, advertising current college classes in LGBTQ studies and so forth. Again, this is not an attack. I am simply stating what is the present in our culture. This is evidence of the reality of the world in which we now live. If the 21st century, the one we're now in, is a return to the first century, as Mount suggests, then not only are we about to remind ourselves of what the first century was like regarding sexuality and fertility cults, but it also gives us pause. If this century is like the first century, then Christianity today is also like the Christianity of the first century. If the 21st century is a return to the first century, then we must understand the church as the church of the first century, the church of the apostles, proclaiming a gospel to a world so much bigger in numbers and area than the church. We are today like the first century church if our culture today is now like the first century culture. If we'll let that soak in, we have an eye-opening reason to be thirsty to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches in the first century through the apocalypse. So let us go back now to the first century and remind ourselves of ancient Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent where it all began. Following the Islamic conquest of the eastern end of the Mediterranean, knowledge of the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia was forgotten in the West. For over 1,000 years at least, the past was buried beneath the sands of a rock. Beginning in the 1850s, Western European archaeologists began excavating ancient Mesopotamia and eventually all the way into Turkey. However, the discovery of King Tut's tomb in Egypt with all of its gold in 1922 captured the imagination of the West, and a fascination with things Egyptian, which continues to the present day. The discoveries of Mesopotamia, though greater in antiquity and ultimately far greater in historical value for understanding the ancient Neolithic past, once more, for all intents and purposes, after 1922 was forgotten in the West. Much like the Ark in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, the artifacts of Mesopotamia were hidden away in museums all over the world. The Sumerian tales, the legends and songs are part of a vast literature inscribed on clay tablets and fragments scattered throughout museums the world over. Their contents, which date back to 2000 BC, are now finally in the process of being deciphered, translated, and interpreted by very small international groups of dedicated scholars. Gradually, they are becoming available, these ancient tablets, in one form or another to the world at large. Inscribed on these tablets and fragments, numbering about 5,000 to 6,000 in all, are hundreds of compositions, myths, epic tales, hymns, psalms, love songs, laments, essays, disputations, proverbs, fables. They constitute a treasure house of comparative source material of the past for the historian of literature and religion, for the biblical as well as classical scholar, and for the folklorist and cultural anthropologist, about humanity, in other words. For example, one of the stories that have been translated is one of the most beautiful pieces of human literature ever written. It tells of the courtship and marriage of the goddess Inanna and Dimitzi, their Sumerian and Akkadian names that were also known later as Ishtar and Tammuz in the Babylonian language. The story contains these lines: He put his hand in her hand. He put his hand to her heart. Sweet is the sleep of hand to hand. Sweeter still, the sleep of heart to heart. The story of Inanna and Dimitzi comes out of the ancient past when the mystery of fertility and fecundity were part of religion. Modern Westerners separate spirituality from sexuality, but for our Neolithic ancestors, religion included being sexual, for it was the Sumerian religious credo that the religious marriage between the king of Sumer and the fertility goddess, full of her sexual allure, was essential for the fertility of the soil and for the fecundity of the womb of both the animals and their human wives, that it brought about the whole prosperity of the land and the well-being of the people in these agricultural societies. The story of Inanna and Dimitzi is sensually romantic and unashamedly erotic. Inanna has two suitors, one a shepherd and the other a farmer. And Inanna, representing the fertility of the earth, looks for the one that will plow her. She is not playing a harlot. She is looking for someone to be the farmer, to husband her, to cultivate her, to love her and gently care for her, and let her bring life from her womb or from the earth. The mystery of life intrigued our ancient ancestors, and they honored women as the givers of life, and they embraced fertility and procreation. From Inmakar's temple at Eridu, the worship of the great goddess Inanna spread throughout the known world. In the 18th century BC, in Babylonia, the Akkadian name of Ishtar began to replace the Sumerian name of Inanna. In Anatolia, that would be Turkey, she was now called Sibyl. To the Greeks, she became Aphrodite, and to the Romans, Venus. The Egyptians worshipped her as Isis, and the Canaanites of Palestine knew her as Ashtoreth or Astarte, and her male counterpart as Baal. You find this in the Old Testament. According to many biblical passages, the idols of the female deity, referred to as Asherah in the lowercase, were to be found on every hill, under every green tree, and alongside altars in the temples throughout the biblical land of Palestine, the Promised Land. The biblical records again and again attest the cult of the Asherah, either as a living tree or a substitute, a post or pole before which the Canaanite altars were set. Well, the struggle with ancient Israel and their neighbors. Ancient Israelites were polytheistic, who acknowledged the existence of many gods and goddesses, even if they only worshiped the one God of their faith. At the heart of polytheism is an open-minded, easygoing approach to religious belief and practice, a willingness to entertain the idea that there are many gods and many ways to worship them. an easy, open approach to everything goes. Anything can go. Believe what you want. Not everyone worshiped every god or goddesses. You see, each person in the pagan world had their favorite deities they honored. Thus, for example, a pagan might be a devotee of the stately old gods of Rome and Greece, and at the very same time, a worshiper of the Syrian goddess known now as the Great Mother, the Persian god called Mithra, or the newfangled cult that conjoined the Egyptian goddess Isis and a freshly minted god called Serapis, which was a conflation of two older Egyptian deities. Religions were being created almost spontaneously throughout the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC and 1st century AD. When ancient Israel settled in Palestine, they brought with them their nomadic god and his tent. In Palestine, they also found local deities that were worshipped across the land. The local deities were male and female deities of agriculture. As reported in the book of 2 Kings, actually that would now be the book of 4 Kings, I believe. I should have checked this out. These notes may have been from a Protestant Old Testament. The Israelites built high places, set up pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. They served idols, made molten images of 2 calves. They made an Asherah and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord. The archaeologists remind us no remnant of the Temple of Solomon has been recovered from the soil of the Holy Land. No trace of the stone tablets on which the 2 commandments were inscribed by the finger of God. But archaeologists have found literally hundreds of teraphim, house gods, artfully fashioned out of rare ivory or humble clay, depicting naked women, some touching their breasts or genitals, all across Palestine, all across the Holy Land. Until recently, such artifacts could be dismissed as pagan relics that had nothing to do with the monotheism of ancient Israel. But new archaeological discoveries, fully as startling as the ones at Tel El Harmana, suggest that they were used by worshipers of the God of Israel also. We're talking about the people in the pews of ancient Israel. They didn't have pews, of course, but the average believer. Well, the fertility rites of paganism. Inanna, the great goddess, Magna Mater, and other deities of agriculture were deities of the earth. The rituals were conducted by priestesses with implicit, if not explicit, sexuality permeating the rituals. Now remember, we're reminding ourselves of what 1st century sexual religions were about that has been mentioned in this letter to the church at Thyatira. In addition to sexual rituals, there were also communal festivals similar to Mardi Gras, in which sexuality was an undertone. In Egypt, for example, archaeologists from Johns Hopkins University discovered a festival of drunkenness that occurred during the reign of the female Pharaoh Hatshepsut in 1470 BC. We are talking about a festival in which people come together in a community to get drunk. Not high, not socially fun, but drunk. Knee walking, absolutely passed out drunk, said Betsy Bryan, leader of the excavation. The whole population came to drink huge quantities of beer, get wasted, indulge in gratuitous sex, and pass out. Some of the inscriptions uncovered at the temple linked the Drunkenness festival with the traveling through the marshes, which Bryan said was an ancient Egyptian euphemism for having sex. Graffiti found at the temple showing men and women in sexual situations reinforce the sexual undertones of the festival. The festival reenacted the myth of Sekhmet, an angry war goddess who nearly destroyed all of mankind until the Egyptian sun god Re got her drunk on massive quantities of ochre-colored beer. Once Sekhmet passed out, she was transformed into a kinder, gentler goddess named Hathor, and humanity was saved. The Romans inherited the male ethos of the Greeks and added to it their own no-nonsense approach, whiny, wheaty, wheaky. I came, I saw, I conquered. Julius Caesar's famous words in the Gallic Wars, history of conquering Gaul. Under Roman rule and regulation, life was squeezed and regulated even more. I came, I saw, I conquered. Get that no-nonsense, rigid. The religion of the Romans was cold and formal, and from the Second Punic War on, had become an instrument of the government in hands of the nobility, those entrusted with its administration, while recognizing the social value of this kind of religion, no longer believed in it themselves. But below the radar, underground secret societies began to embrace inside the Roman Empire the vitality of the old Eastern religions that celebrated the mystery of life and birth and that honored women for being the givers of life. These underground secret societies collectively were called mystery religions. These mystery religions, while underground, were nonetheless redefined by the larger masculine culture, which increasingly is going to make them more sexual and domineering of women. These mystery religions primarily were often an assertion of sexuality in defiance of the over-rationalistic Roman world, in much the same way that spring break, Girls Gone Wild, and Mardi Gras are assertions of sexuality against an over-rationalistic academic world of the university. There were three main mystery religions that all sought to restore a sense of mystery to the practice of religion, rather than the cut and dry staleness of the public ritual of the state, of the government. We can think of the President of the United States placing flowers at the tomb of the unknowns. I mean, no disrespect to our veterans and especially those who have died in our wars. But it's a somber political service that in no way is a religious service. It's not intended to be a religious service, but in ancient Rome, it would have been seen as a religious service, but it has no vitality of living and life to worshipers in the normal sense of the word, a worshiper. In place of that, these mystery religions were sexual and done in secret, and the label mystery refers less to it being secretive as the initial root of the term mystery, and I've got it spelled out here. Let me just say it comes from the word muo, which means shh, M-U-O, M-Y-O, depending on how you bring it over into our language, shh, which sounds like shh, it's a secret, don't tell anybody. And from this word, you can get mysterion. It is where our word mystery comes from. And so a mysterion is a secret that remains a secret and is not told to everybody. It is a secret that is shared, and it's the way friends will say, this is a secret, don't tell anybody, only it had to be kept, the promise. And so from this word muo, shh, it's a secret, comes a second word, mythos, which means the secret story. I'm going to tell you a story, and here's its secret. You take mythos and you put it into our alphabet, and it becomes myth. And a myth, you see, originally meant a secret story, a story that not everyone knows what the meaning is. And there was a second part or second meaning from this that becomes the verb that was myo or myeo. It was the act of being initiated into the mystery, initiated into the secret, being told the meaning of the secret. This is where our initiation rites for sororities and fraternities at American universities has arisen from, of being initiated into the membership and the different kind of adult organizations across society, whatever they might be, that have the secret initiation rites that are only known to those who have been initiated. These were not state religions. They were not formal, cold pageants. These are personal, private religions involving a personal choice of whether to belong and to be initiated. Unlike the mechanical offering of incense to a statue of an emperor, mystery religions centered on the intimate and practical concerns that moved their congregants, their people, to prayer, happiness in their marriage, healing of illness, safety while traveling, a full purse, and a full belly. Most of the things that concern all of us even today. Above all, these mystery religions, compared to Rome and religion, held out the tantalizing and even thrilling opportunity of experiencing, of achieving, if only for a moment, some sort of direct encounter with the divine. The encounter with the divine, however, often included a sexual encounter with a human or several humans. By the time of the Roman Empire, the connection of these mystery religions with the earlier fertility rites of an agricultural world had been severed. They were no longer just for agriculture. They were now for the pleasure inside the cities. And they existed primarily as a sexual protest against the dead public religion of Rome. We might think of the so-called sexual revolution of the so-called 60s as a sexual protest against the lockdown that had taken place during the Cold War. And now let me make just a quick and excursus, a note. We're actually headed somewhere, but this was a tough one to cover. At the beginning of the 20th century, German scholars, Albert Schweitzer among them, began a movement known as the History of Religion School. It was an effort to somehow demonstrate that Christianity was merely the product of its time, having borrowed and adapted ideas already in wide circulation to craft their claims about Christ. They're trying to say that even as religion in their day, Christianity, adapted itself to culture, that in fact is how the gospel had gotten created in the first place. They read backwards from their day and age of hybridization to saying Christianity itself was a product of hybridization. Among these other German scholars, Richard Reitzenstein concentrated on the similarities he saw between Christianity and the mystery religions, and he sought to show the direct dependence of early Christianity on Hellenistic, Mandean, Iranian mythology and ritual. Now, I'm mentioning all of this because we're talking about mystery religions. I've just said them. I want you to know that there is part of so-called religious scholarship that saw that relationship, and then wants to say Christianity is a hybridization from that. I am not saying that, quite the contrary. But we cannot have our heads in the sands when our culture is something else than we think it is, and when there are voices in the world attacking Christianity and the gospel for having been a hybridization itself in the first place. The apocalypse is written against hybridization. We've got to wake up and understand, have ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And I'm going out on a limb here, but I dare say these 19th century or 20th century German theologians were not hearing what the Spirit was saying to the churches. Wow, I'll get in trouble for that, I know. In his book, Reitzenstein's book, his Hellenistic Mystery Religions, published in 1910, it became the classic work that led to a whole century, all of the 20th century scholars attempting to show Christianity to be an example of a mystery religion, albeit a poor example in that it was a conglomeration of many other religions with little of anything original in it. Walter Burkert, professor of classical philology at the University of Zurich, had been invited to speak at Harvard University. And at the beginning of his Carl Newell Jackson lectures at Harvard, he acknowledged this foundational work that Reitzenstein and Franz Kuhlmann had influencing an entire generation of scholars. And then this noted theologian scholar from Zurich, he then stated that by 1987, the value of all of Reitzenstein and a whole generation of scholars had eroded. All that remained were stereotypes and preconceptions regarding the so-called mystery religions, in addition to what damage had been done to Christianity. He is going to argue, Burkert is going to argue, that everything they said about the so-called mystery religions must be challenged, since those ideas led to half-truths at best, if not to outright misunderstandings. In his lectures, Burkert dismissed 3 outdated stereotypes of the relationship of mystery religions, including the stereotype that the mystery religions were somehow spiritual, because in fact, mystery religions were not even a religion in the full sense of the word. However, simultaneously, in the very same year that Burkert is challenging all of this hogwash that's existed for 100 years inside academic, biblical, theological scholarship, in the same year that Burkert challenges it, Marvin W. Meyer published his book, A Source Book of Ancient Texts, which is a useful collection of ancient sources related to a variety of mystery religions. The Greek mysteries of the Grain Mother and Daughter, probably the Great Mother and Daughter, the Adanian mysteries of Messenia, the Greek mysteries of Dionysius, the Anatolian mysteries of the Great Mother, her lover and the Syrian goddess, the Egyptian mysteries and Osiris, the Roman mysteries of Mithras. However, all of that might be accurate. Then Meyer, who was at the time professor of religious studies at Chapman University, project director at the Institute of Antiquity and Christianity at the Claremont Graduate School, and co-director of the Albert Schweitzer Institute, continued this same stereotype pronounced obsolete by Burkert, when Meyer concluded in his book with a final chapter, The Mysteries Within Judaism and Christianity, and then closed his book with his epilogue on dying and rising. Meyer pointedly states his reason for including Christianity within his source book of mystery religions. This quick sketch of Judaism and early Christianity, deliberately drawn in order to stress points of similarity with the mystery religions, clarifies why students of religion in the ancient world and in more recent times have considered some expressions of Judaism and numerous manifestations of Christianity to be quite in harmony with the mystery religions. And his 3 examples included of the numerous manifestations of Christianity in harmony with these mystery religions are these 3. A document by Clement of Alexandria to Theodore, the Gospel of Philip, and another document by Clement of Alexandria, an exhortation to the Greeks. It should be noted that Clement of Alexandria is not considered a church father by the Orthodox Church. His name was removed from the Roman Catholic list in 1586 AD. The Gospel of Philip is, of course, a non-canonical Gnostic book. Lest we dismiss Burkert and Meyer as dueling academic professors that have nothing to do with us, the public in general, and certainly nothing to do with us in particular, considered that the book, if this becomes a book and you're reading it, or the seminar that you're listening to, when I wrote it in 19 September of 2020, just 5 days before I wrote these words, 5 days before I wrote what I've just shared, this book was published. The Gnostic Mysteries, the Lost Secret Teachings of the Inner Christ. This 446-page book published, what did I just say, 5 days before I wrote the comments we've just shared. This book was just published. It advertises itself based on Christianity's Gnostic foundations and the lost teachings of Jesus. This book is a thought-provoking conjecture on ways to manifest the kingdom of heaven on earth, an inspirational reminder of what Christianity was intended to be. Well, wow! It looks authentic, doesn't it? It looks important. It says it is. Lest in our incredulity we dismiss this neo-Gnostic, claiming to be one of the ancient Christianities, did you get the plural? As some insignificant group. Well, what weirdo group is this? This has got to be some off-the-wall wild group, something out of the hippies of the 60s, I guess. This book carries the following endorsement on the back. Jacqueline's writings are full of wisdom and insight that offer valuable teachings for our personal inner journey of awakening. Those comments are from John Mackey, co-founder and CEO of Whole Foods Market. We're not talking about some obscure, unimportant, unheard of group. We have our heads buried in the sands. Let those who have ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And if you think what in the world are we doing with all of this history? I just want the Bible. It makes a difference, folks, let me tell you. I'm holding in my hands the Roman imperial cult for Emperor Anastasius I, a practical manual for the worship of the divine emperor, composed by someone calling himself Marcus Cassius Julianus, and it's filled with daily prayers for this and that you would now pray to the now divine Roman Emperor Anastasius I, who this book claims was at some point one of the Christian emperors of the, he would call it the Byzantine Empire. This was published in July 18th, 2020. Welcome to the 21st century. We're back to square one. We are in the first century. Wow. And that big old world out there is bigger than us. And the apocalypse of John is telling us, but it's not bigger than the God who created this universe. Wow. If we can ever get to realizing, let's hear what the Spirit is saying to us, not about some political rebellion out there, not trying to figure out that this Bible is a code book predicting some kind of political future. And let's realize it's for the church living in the midst of a pagan world. It is for the gospel to be proclaimed in the midst of a fallen world, for whom God became flesh and dwelt among a pagan world in order to give life to that pagan world. He did not come to condemn that pagan world. That pagan world is a world of death. We're all living in it. But He has come that we might have life and have it abundantly. We've got to recognize that in the incarnation, God became flesh. He became flesh at a particular time, at a particular place in history. In the fullness of time, He became flesh. We have to understand that the gospel, as it's embodied in the New Testament, is historically embodied in every generation of believers. Every generation. We are all starting at square one in our walk with God to embrace this gospel of becoming like the image of God within us. And so again and again and again, the gospel comes to say, here already, now already, He who is coming is here. He who is always coming to every generation has come here in our lifetime, is available to us in our lives now. Well, I must hurry. Let's see. We've got just a little bit more to finish up the letter to Thyatira, so let's see if we can finish it and then take a quick break after that. Many of the mystery religions borrowed ideas and rituals from each other. They were a hybrid of the hybrid. The mystery religions separately and collectively were affected by religious syncretism in doctrine and cult, and by borrowing and mutual interaction. Many of them approximated to each other, so that in many ways they kind of became indistinguishable. For example, both Mithra, that came from Persia, and Magna Mater, the Great Mother, which came from Mesopotamia, both of these made use of the Taurobolium, Taurus the bull. In the Mithra religion, the Taurobolium was used to initiate new worshipers into the religion. It would have been their baptism, if you will, using our term. But in the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, only the high priestess was consecrated by the Taurobolium. The Roman historian Prudentius is going to give us the account. He said that a deep pit or a basement was created, over which a wooden floor of wooden planks with wide spaces that crisscrossed into a mesh is placed. The woman to be consecrated would stand inside the pit or in the basement underneath this floor. After the floor was in place, a huge bull would be then brought onto that floor. And now let me quote directly from Prudentius. Here, as is ordained, they pierce the bull's breast with a sacred spear. The gaping wound emits a wave of hot blood, and the smoking river flows into this mesh, the woven structure beneath it, and now it surges wide. And then by many paths of the 1,000 openings in the lattice, the falling shower rains down a foul dew, which the priestess buried within catches, putting her head under all the drops. She throws her face back. She puts her cheeks in the way of the blood. She puts under it her ears and her lips. She interposes her nostrils. She washes her eyes with the fluid. Nor does she spare her throat, but even moistens her tongue until she actually drinks the dark gore. Afterwards, the corpse, stiffening now that its blood has gone forth, is hauled off the lattice, and the priestess, horrible in appearance, comes forth and shows her wet head, her hair heavy with blood, and her garments sodden with it. This woman they now all hail and worship from a distance, because the ox's blood has washed her, and she was born again for eternity. Wow. To say that our concept of baptism and being begotten from above came from that is nonsense. What about John the Baptist? Wow. One more. Sybil and transgenderism. One version of the Magna Mater went by the name Sybil. This version told the story of the goddess Sybil falling in love with the young shepherd Attis, who was about to be married. In order to stop the marriage, Sybil sends him into a frenzy of desire for her. But he frustrates her efforts by committing suicide by castrating himself. The ritual of initiation into the cult of Sybil included a period of fasting, followed by the consumption of libations with high alcoholic content, and finally a spell of music, drumming, and dancing. Have you got it? Starvation, massive amounts of alcoholic beverages, and pounding, throbbing, drumming, dancing, wild music. Man after man, his veins throbbing with the music, would then fling off his garments, leap forth with a shout, seizing one of the swords which stood ready for the purpose, castrated himself on the spot. Then he ran through the city, holding the bloody pieces in his hand, till he threw them into one of the houses which he passed in his mad career. The household thus honored had to furnish him with a suit of female attire and female ornaments, which he now wore for the rest of his life. The third mystery religion, Isis, came to Rome from Egypt. Osiris, brother to Isis and her lover, was murdered and dismembered. Isis gathers all of his body parts to bring him back to life, except she cannot find the penis. She makes an artificial one and restores her dead lover to life. Frescoes on the walls of the Roman city of Pompeii and statues there show men with exaggerated penises, female initiates to the mystery religions for women carried a large box in Pompeii which contained an artificial penis exaggerated in size. It is not difficult to see exactly how and why these mystery religions appeal to a citizenry that was jaded and bored by the formalistic rites of classical paganism. The rigid, passionless, oppressive nature of the Romans thus led to the rise of the mystery religions as the acolytes of these new and exotic gods and goddesses found an attentive audience. Devotees of Mithra, Magnum Mater, Isis, as well as the followers of the god of wine Bacchus, formed an underground network of secret initiations designed to unite one with the gods through drinking and sexual frenzy. The religions of the Romans were regarded by the ruling class of ancient Rome as just a civic duty, an essential part of statecraft. For the ordinary man and woman in the Roman Empire who sought some kind of comfort from the gods, the high ceremonials of the emperor's cult had little or nothing to offer. The Roman Senate sought to impose sexual law in order on a lively populace. In 186 BC, the Roman Senate called for using force to dispose of the depraved foreign superstition, referring to the Bacchanalia of the cult of Dionysius. With the ascension of power, the male sky gods of the Greeks and Romans had dethroned the goddesses of the earth, but neither dethronement or legislative acts of the Roman Senate could destroy those religions based on sexual realities of our species, as the frescoes on the walls of Pompeii, only 150 miles from Rome, attest. We're almost done with our look at this city. It was into this kind of world, this cultural synesthesia and shared ethos, that Christ and the church were born. It was into this first century world, a world not very much different from our 21st century world. 2,000 years later, the world seems to be now where it was 1,000 years ago. The post-Christian world looks very much like the pre-Christian world. Here we are at the end of the 20th century, wrote one scholar, redefining gender, deity, sexualities, theology, and the parameters of human hegemony. We struggle with the power of emotion to destroy our relationships and the power of nature to destroy us. We didn't even have COVID-19 on the horizon when she wrote that. Despite our fantasies of security, we struggle with inner and outer violence, how to survive loss with integrity, and how to have faith in something beyond humanity at a time when human capacity seems to be expanding exponentially. 21st century, welcome to the first century. Welcome to the apocalypse. Welcome to Thyatira. The Christian community in Thyatira heeded the words of Christ in his letter to them. They survived in Thyatira 1,900 years until the Muslims drove them out of Turkey in 1922. There is still an archbishop of Thyatira today. His Eminence Nikitas Lulius, consecrated in 2019. He resides in London and oversees the Greek Orthodox Church in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Malta. But hold fast what you have till I come. And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations, over the ethnicities. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Well, let us take a quick break. We'll come back and see if we can briefly then look at the letter to Sardis. See you in just a minute. Well, welcome back after the break. If you have the PDF file, you'll see at the end of our comments on Thyatira, we have a photograph there of the ruins of the ancient city, and you can see the size there of the Orthodox Church, the Basilica. It would have been a very large church. You can tell by its dimensions of the success of the church and the Christians there. Well, now let us turn to the letter to the church in Sardis, found in Revelations chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. And to the angel of the church in Sardis write, these things says he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your works, and that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead. Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain, that are ready to die, for I have not found your works perfect. That word means complete. So I've not found your works completed, finished before God. Remember, therefore, how you have received and heard. How you have received and heard. Hold fast and repent. Turn around. Therefore, if you will not watch, I will come upon you as a thief, and you will not know what hour I will come upon you. You have a few names, even in Sardis, who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Ancient Sardis had a glorious beginning. In the Babylonian Empire, the region of Lydia in the western end of Turkey was an ally of the Babylonians. Sardis was the capital then of Lydia. Under the Persians, Sardis became a satrap and a chief city on the western edge of the Persian Empire. Sardis maintained its status and prominence in the Seleucid and the Roman empires as well. Under Caesar Augustus, Sardis requested and received permission to create an imperial cult in honor of Augustus' son. Later, a temple to Tiberius and the Roman Senate would come, and the large temple of the goddess Artemis with its extremely large, colossal statues, dominated the city. Sardis had been the capital of the ancient kingdom of Lydia, as I said, Western Turkey. It was the westernmost city, therefore, of the Persian Empire. It was an administrative city of the Seleucid Empire and a seat of the proconsul in the Roman Empire. So it was not an insignificant city. When Croesus, the king of the Lydian kingdom, when the craftsmen there during the time that Croesus was the king, the craftsmen discovered the means of separating gold from silver in the nuggets of electrum, which was a natural occurring alloy in the area of gold and silver mixed together. And electrum had been used for centuries as money, as currency, but the value of each nugget or coin was always suspect because you couldn't really know how much gold and how much silver was part of each coin. Once Sardis, the craftsmen there, discovered how to separate the gold from the silver, once they began creating pure gold coins along with pure silver coins, Sardis suddenly became rich, and Croesus' name became synonymous with wealth itself. I don't know if you hear it today, but you used to hear it said he was as rich as Croesus. The importance of Sardis in the Roman Empire became obvious, or becomes obvious to us, when an earthquake destroyed Sardis in 17 AD. The city was rebuilt by Tiberius, the second emperor of the Roman Empire, who donated 10 million sesterces, I don't know how to say it, approximately $9 million in 2017 currency, sesterces, as well as exempted Sardis from paying taxes for 5 years. The emperor spent $9 million and exempted them from paying taxes for 5 years while they got back on their feet. The importance of Sardis diminished slowly until 1204, when the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade sacked and raped Constantinople. Though Constantinople was reclaimed from the Crusaders in 1261, Sardis, along with the rest of Turkey, remained neglected and in steep decline until the Muslim Turks conquered the area and destroyed Sardis in 1402. Archaeologists have discovered the ruins of both a Christian church and a Jewish synagogue in the ruins of ancient Sardis. And of course, the most dominant ruin was that temple of Artemis. And you have there a photograph of the ruins, and you can see the giant columns of the temple of Artemis. And notice how tiny the little Orthodox church is compared to the size of the one that we saw in Thyatira. And there you also see the ruins of a Jewish synagogue, and it would seem to be quite larger than the little basilica of the Christian church. And then it's not quite a good photograph when enlarged, but you see an aerial view of the heart of ancient Sardis, where you can see the little bitty basilica there backs up against what used to be the whole temple complex of that massive temple to Artemis. Let us consider the term the Book of Life. that we read in this letter. According to Jewish scholars, the book of life is more correctly called the book of the living, the Sefer Hayim in Hebrew, a heavenly book in which the names of the righteous are inscribed. The term is found only once in the Hebrew Bible, in Psalm 69:29. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. Let them not be enrolled among the righteous. The Jewish Publication Society's Hebrew-English Tanakh uses the term book of life instead of the book of the living in its 2003 Tanakh translation. Let them have no share of your beneficence. May they be erased from your book of life and not be inscribed with the righteous. The erasure of a sinner's name from such a registry is equivalent to death, as was implied in Isaiah 69:29 and in the pleas of Moses found in Exodus 32 and 33, where Moses says, "Now if you will forgive their sin, well and good, but if not, erase me from the record which you have written." But the Lord said to Moses, "He who has sinned against me, him will I erase from my record." This passage from Exodus implies a record of one's good deeds from which bad deeds could result in one's name being erased, and thus causing one whose name was erased to miss out on the reward of life. Thus, one had to somehow get their name written in the book and then guard against their name being erased or blotted out of the book. Now let me just note that this is the basis on which the Jewish legalism and the Jewish legalistic approach to God is based. It's created out of some sense of rule keeping, getting your name on the good list and not erased. Jewish scholars note that belief in the existence of heavenly ledgers is alluded to several times in the Bible. Of course, it would be the Old Testament. Isaiah 65:6, Jeremiah 17:1, 22 and 30, Malachi 3:16, Psalms 40 verse 8, 87:6, 139:16, Job 13:26, Daniel 7:10, Daniel 12:1, Nehemiah 13:14. Even these scholars, while acknowledging the exact meaning of some of these texts, along with 1 Samuel 25:29, however, still remains in doubt, as well as other examples found in the Apocrypha, Jewish Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. For example, Jubilees, 1 Enoch, 1 Baruch, and then in the New Testament, Luke 10:20 and Philippians 4:3 and Hebrews 12:23. Secondly, in addition to the idea of a heavenly ledger being widespread within Judaism and then Christian Judaism, who brought it over from their Judaism, the idea itself also widely existed within the larger cultural context of Mesopotamia and the Middle East. Jewish scholars write, this belief in a heavenly ledger can be traced to Mesopotamia, where the gods were believed to possess tablets recording the deeds and destiny of men. Examples are the prayer of Ashurbanipal to Nabu, the divine scribe, "My life is inscribed before thee," and the prayer of Shemashum Akin, may Nabu inscribe the days of his life for long duration on a tablet. The exact equivalent of the Hebrew prayer Sefer Hayim is found in a temple from the Neo-Assyrian period and may also be present in a Sumerian hymn as well. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from which the human ancestors of all mankind, of all humanity ate, and caused humanity to develop systems of right and wrong, good and evil, and led humanity to view the creating one as somehow to be a divine record keeper whose ledger was filled with our deeds, both good and evil, upon which our future reward or punishment would be based. Even Santa Claus in 20th century America was making a list and checking it twice, going to find out who's naughty and nice. He knows when you are sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been good or bad. So be good for goodness sake. Santa Claus is coming to town. Of importance for us is not the origin of the idea of a divine ledger book, but the use made of the idea within rabbinic Judaism. In the Mishnah of Rabbi Akiva speaks in detailed terms of the heavenly ledger in which all man's actions are written down until the inevitable day of reckoning comes. On the basis of the above-mentioned reference to the Book of Life in Psalms, however, or according to another Amorah of the plea of Moses, the Talmud states 3 books are opened in heaven on Rosh Hashanah, one for the thoroughly wicked, one for the thoroughly righteous, and one for the intermediate in between. The thoroughly righteous are forthwith inscribed in the book of life, the thoroughly wicked in the book of death, while the fate of the intermediate is suspended until the day of atonement. I wonder if that's where the Roman Catholic concept or idea of an intermediate state of purgatory comes from. This passage has greatly influenced, I'm quoting our Jewish theologians, has greatly influenced the whole conception of the Jewish high holidays and find its expression in the liturgy and piyutim of these days. Of the 4 special insertions in the Amidah for the 10 days of penitence, 3 of them are prayers for the inscription in the Book of Life. I apologize to our Jewish friends. I don't speak Hebrew any better than I do Greek, and not even close to the poor way I even speak English, it seems. And it is the basis of the moving prayer of Utanani Tukef. That was before 70 AD and the destruction of the Jewish temple. Festering Jewish apocalyptic nationalism erupted in the First Jewish-Roman War. We must never forget Jewish apocalypticism erupted in a cultural and political war against Rome. John knows this, and John is this apocalypse of John coming from Jesus Christ is absolutely a warning against nationalistic, apocalyptic, eschatological messianism. Looking for the Messiah and implementing the revolution to usher whatever God's about to do. He mentions, and it is set in this historical period, that the Jews and this apocalyptic messianic expectationism destroyed them. 66 AD, they started their rebellion, sought to trigger the coming of their Messiah. Rome won round 1 in 70 AD, destroyed the Jewish temple and Jerusalem. The Jewish apocalyptic nationalism continued to erupt from 66 AD until Rome's final victory in 136 AD. 70 years this nonsense lasted. In the defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which for all intents and purposes ended Jewish apocalyptic nationalism. And if you don't get the 70 years, John is writing almost halfway through it in the apocalypse. He ended Jewish apocalyptic nationalism at least until its rebirth in Theodor Herzl's Zionism in 1897 and the creation of the modern Israeli state following World War II and its adoption, Zionism's adoption by American Protestant fundamentalism in general, and Hal Lindsey's The Great Planet Earth in particular. At the beginning of the First Roman War, many Jewish rabbis and members of the Jewish Sanhedrin Council fled to the Palestinian city of Jamnia, often pronounced Jabneh or Yavneh. The Tananim, which would have been your rabbinic teachers, sages, we would call them today inside Christianity the church fathers, whose views became the basis of the Jewish Mishnah, were influential for 210 years, from 10 AD to 220 AD. Yohanan ben Zakkai was considered the leading sage at the end of the Second Temple period, 70 AD when it was wiped out, and in the years immediately following the destruction of the temple. Zakkai fled to Yavneh, and after the Romans destroyed the temple. Zakkai in Yavneh established a yeshiva, a Jewish seminary. He also prepared the groundwork for establishing the Bet Din, a rabbinical court in Yavneh, with Rabban Gamaliel as the Nazi, the chief justice of this court. When the Sanhedrin fled to Yavneh after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the Sanhedrin moved, with Gamaliel now in charge. The religion of ancient Israel, based on a tabernacle temple, ended in 70 AD. From Yavneh, the Tananim and rabbis of the Bet Din Council took specific rabbinic measures to create something new, a rabbinic Judaism in the absence of the Israelite temple faith. Out of these rabbinic measures developed a unified and corporate understanding of a new Judaism, not based on the temple, but on the synagogues. The period following the destruction of the temple saw the beginning of the process of self-definition on the rabbinic side and the beginning of the attempt made by the Yavnians and their successors to extend their authority over other Jews and to rabbinize Judaism. On the other hand, making no distinction between Jews and Christians, the Romans saw the presence of non-Jews within the Christian Jewish sect as evidence of evangelistic proselytizing by Jews among the non-Jewish population of the empire. And therefore, these converts were seen as evidence that the Jews were guilty of disobeying the edict of Claudius, and by so doing had placed their religious freedom permitted them in jeopardy. In response to the harshness now inflicted upon all Jews by the Domitian edict of 85 AD, on that harsh enforcement of the Fiscus Judaicus, that Jewish tax, the Jewish council, the Bet Din, the Sanhedrin of Yavne, began the expulsion of Christian Jews from the synagogues. This is the basis for the setting for the man born blind in the Gospel of John. The council authorized, in addition to kicking Jews who became Christians out, the council authorized a benediction against the Menim, the heretics, be created as the 12th petition in the Shemini Ezra, the prayer with the 18 benedictions, the 18 blesseds. This new 12th petition was a curse known as the Birkat Ha-Menim. The 12th petition identified 4 groups that God was asked, let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Christian Jews were now one of the 4 groups to be not inscribed in the book of life, according to the rabbis. The rabbinical court began to codify the Jewish liturgy of the synagogue, the central prayer of Judaism, the Shemini Ezra, the 18 benedictions, the prayer with the 18 benedictions, 18 blesseds, was codified at Yavne in the days of Gamaliel II around 90 AD, the time of the apocalypse. A new petition was inserted, becoming the 12th petition and making a total of 19 in this prayer of the 18 benedictions. This new 12th was actually a curse known as the Birkat Ha-Menim, a petition against the heretics. The Babylonian Talmud gives the origin of the Birkat Ha-Menim this way. Our rabbis taught, Simeon HaGakuli ordered the 18 benedictions before Rabban Gamaliel in Yavne. Rabban Gamaliel said to the sages, is there no one who knows how to compose a benediction against the Menim? The Menim. And Samuel HaKatan stood up and composed it. The oldest extant version of the Birkat Ha-Menim, the Geniza or the Geniza version, was discovered among the Geniza manuscripts in Cairo in 1864. It reads this: "For the apostates let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted in our days. Let the Nostrim and the Minim be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life, and not be inscribed together with the righteous." And then the benediction, the blessed: "Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humbles the arrogant." This Birkat HaMinim singled out 4 groups to be blotted out of the book of life: the Jews who had abandoned their faith, imperial Rome, that was the government. The apostates would be the Jews that had destroyed the temple. The third group would be the Nostrim, and the fourth group was the Minim. In 90 AD, the Nostrim would have been Jewish Christians, and the Minim would have been other Jewish heretical sects. If Christian Judaism was now a heretical sect to the Jews, then other groups, maybe the Ebionites and maybe the Nicolaitans and so forth, the Jezebel groups had as well. Not until after 313 AD and the Christianization of the Roman Empire under Constantine would Nostrim come to refer to Gentile Christians as well. Up until then, it was just Jewish Christians that were being asked to be blotted out of the book of life. The prayer of 18 benedictions codified at Yavne was said 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. 3 times a day, it reinforced the identity of those opposed to Judaism: the apostates, the arrogant government, and 2 groups of heretics, Jewish Christians and other heretical groups. 3 times each day, this 12th benediction, the Birkat HaMinim, identified those excluded from the book of life, those excluded from us, the righteous Jews. The 12th benediction functioned not so much as a curse, but as a dividing line between us and them, between true Judaism and not true Judaism. The rabbinical court, the Bet Din in Yavne, the Sanhedrin, established the parameters of normative rabbinic Judaism. Once established, normative Judaism set out to convert all Jews to this new rabbinic norm and set to marginalize and exclude all non-normative, non-conforming Minim, now heretical groups claiming a Jewish heritage or connection, but not abiding by the new set of rabbinic rules. From the point of view of normative rabbinic Judaism, among those heretical groups claiming a Jewish heritage or connection were Christians, Ebionites, Mandeans, and Gnostics. The 18 benedictions and its Birkat HaMinim, be blotted out of the book of life, began the daily process of defining normal, definitive rabbinic Judaism within the synagogue. Within that definition was embedded an exclusion of those believing Jesus to be the Messiah. Well, what about the Book of Life then in 90 AD? By the end of the first century, Rabbinic Judaism had further defined those considered to be minim. The classical definition of heresy, and therefore who were heretics, in Tanaitic Judaism is found in the Mishnah Sanhedrin. After this had already been stated in it, all Israel has a portion in the world to come. All Israel has a portion in the world to come. And that would have included non-Jews who would have been of the tribe of Reuben, or the tribe of Dan, or the tribe of Levi. Israel. The following are those who do not, out of Israel, have a portion in the world to come. The one who says there is no resurrection from the dead. The one who says the Torah is not from heaven, is not divine. And the Epikuros. This classic location excludes three groups from the world to come. The first group is the Sadducees, who denied there is a resurrection from the dead. The second group are the Jewish Christians, who said the Messiah was from heaven, and therefore the Messiah was higher than Moses. That is, the Messiah was above the Torah created by Moses. And the third group of heretics were Jews, the Epikuros, a corruption of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. The Epikuros were strongly Hellenized Jews who no longer practiced the Jewish faith. One may assume that these were mainly apostate Jews. They were ethnic Jews, but had nothing to do with any of the religion. It is important to note that the issue of heresy and heretics did not originate within the church, nor was it a later invention of the church. Heresy, heresiology, the making of and keeping of what the rules of heresy, developed first inside Rabbinic Judaism in response to the claim of Christian Jews to be the true Israel. Remember, Paul had much to say about that. It is hardly conceivable that the claim of being the real Israel stemmed originally from Gentile Christianity. A quick note here on what is the true Israel. I mention this because so many people are unaware of what the church has always said about our relationship to Abraham and being an Israelite. The Christian claim to be the real Israel was initially made by Jewish Christians exclusively for themselves and not necessarily for Gentile Christians as well. Gentile Christians were the essential representatives of the nations, the ethnicities within the Jewish Messianic movement, but were never regarded as Jews or members of the people of Israel by Jewish Christians. They were part of the Messianic kingdom as Gentiles. Only after the distinction between Jewish and Gentile Christian had disappeared was a claim of being the real Israel extended to include all Christians. The fact that you had non-Jews inside Christianity and ethnic Jews had died out now meant that the Gentile Christians took up the claim of the Jewish Christians that Christianity was the continuation of true Israel. Once the distinction between Jewish and Gentile Christians disappeared in the 2nd century, the distinction of who was the real Israel created then, once we say we're the true Israel, creates then a paradigm for establishing who is or what is the real church. Beginning in the 2nd century, the church began defining itself against Christian heretical groups in much the same way that Rabbinic Judaism had continued to define itself against Christian Judaism and others. Jewish scholar Daniel Boyarin, commenting on 2nd century rabbinic and Christian discourse, notes the similarities in the development of heresiology in both rabbinic and Christian writings. It's almost an identical happening simultaneously now. The development of heresiology, of heresy and defining a heretic in Judaism in the 1st century and within Christianity in the 2nd century was of course spurred by the policies of imperial Rome. If the Jews or the Christians were to be punished or executed by Rome, they each wanted to make certain it was for the action of real Jews or the action of real Christians that they were being persecuted, and not for the actions of some other so-called Jewish group or some other so-called Christian group. They're heretics. We're not them. If you want to be mad at somebody for being idiots, it's them. It's not us. That brings us back then to this letter to the church. What are we? Sardis. The Birkat Hamanim excluded those named from the book of life. The 12th petition was against them. It had the 4 groups. We've already said that. We've already reminded ourselves that the Mishnah Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin, clarified that all Israel would be in the world to come except the Sadducees, the Christian Jews, and then the apostates. The mention of the book of life in the Apocalypse not only has this general historical context within both Judaism and Christian Judaism, it also now has a specific historical context. By the 90s AD, this letter to this church is a direct response to the 12th benediction, the Birkat Hamanim, that asked God to blot out the names of Christian Jews from the book of life. And Revelation 3:5, in answer to that Jewish curse on Christian Jews, God declares, "He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels." The issue in the Apocalypse is Jesus Christ versus Caesar, Jesus Christ versus the rabbinic Bet Din, It is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, He who is the Ancient of Days, He who has the two-edged sword, He who has the feet of brass. It is a revelation of who is the creator of the universe, who has created this world, who's ultimately in charge, and who do you and I serve. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. This was a message to all Christian Jews whose names were being blotted from the membership of all the synagogues. This was a message to Christian Jews that their names had not and would not be blotted out of the book of life, regardless of how many times each day prayers were offered for their names to be erased. He who overcomes, and not just Christian Jews, but all Christians, Jews and Gentiles alike, he who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear to hear what the Spirit is saying to us, to his churches in 2020. Amen. We'll see you next week, God willing.